we think the US economy will remain robust for most of the year, but at some point you will have the impact of fading fiscal support, but that will be somewhat offset by still healthy consumption, depending on what happens with the labour market. And we will likely see a building of inventories, which will support growth in the US as well. In the UK, we'd be slightly mindful of the fact that the economy is faced with both the pandemic shock and the Brexit shock, and so improvements on the supply side of the economy may be slightly slower coming in the UK, and that's actually one of the reasons why we think that the Bank of England's hiking cycle will be relatively short-lived and front-loaded. It's also worth bearing in mind that in the UK, once the policy rate reaches 0.5%, at that point the Bank of England will cease reinvesting maturing securities on its balance sheet, and so you're going to have balance sheet unwind commencing, and so that's why we think that the policy stance in the UK will pause, and you'll have a prolonged pause after the policy rate gets to around 75 basis points. And then in Europe, we would say, as Sylvia just mentioned, it seems to be a couple of quarters slightly lagging behind what's happening in the US, and you even prior to the onset of Omicron, you had renewed restrictions due to spread of Delta, and so that could be a near-term headwind to growth in the euro area. I think big picture thinking in terms of what risks does Omicron present, we think in the near term you could see growth is slightly more muted, but that would likely be followed by a pickup and improvement in growth in the second half of next year, hopefully once we have vaccination rates and boosters pick up. And then in terms of thinking about what Omicron means for the demand and the supply side and what that means for inflation, we think that it could be both a demand and a supply shock. And so it's going to be important to see what happens in terms of voluntary behaviour beyond actual lockdown and restrictions that are introduced. And then finally, I would say on China, we do expect growth to slow next year from around 7.8% this year to 5% next year. That is a slow rate of growth in the context of China, but still solid when you compare to other economies.